Deep inside the Arizona Territory records, beneath the slow dust of frontier offices and the neglect of men who preferred profit to truth, sits a sheriff's memorandum dated October 15, 1876, a paper that should never have been forgotten. It recounts the discovery of human remains in a root cellar on the Henley Ranch, 12 miles northeast of the scrub that would one day be called Phoenix. But the note scrawled in the deputy's margins is the detail that will not leave you. The family ate him. Unknowing, perhaps, but the sentence sits like a stone in the mouth of history. For nearly 150 years, the descendants of those who knew that line have kept it hidden, like a sickness you do not name. Before we go further, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Say it. The autumn of 1876 brought more than a chill wind to the sprawling cattle country that arrived as accusation. The Henley Ranch crouched against the desert like an old bruise, its buildings sun-bleached and leaned, its porches sagging as if tired from holding up the family's reputation. Samuel Henley had claimed the land during the cattle rush of 1863, when men with more stubbornness than sense crossed deserts and signed deeds with hopeful hands. By 1876, those hopes had congealed into a harsher thing: debts, thin profits, and a temper that grew bitter with each failed season. The ranch employed 24 men at times, making the Henley name more of a presence than a neighbor. In the scattered settlements from the Salt River trading posts to Tucson, their name carried weight. Martha came as Samuel's bride in the spring of 1869, a pale woman from Missouri whose family had been taken by cholera, who arrived at 22 with a quiet reserve and skills that suited a frontier household. She read and wrote better than many women on the range, kept accounts, cleaned, sewed, and managed the kitchen with an efficiency that should have been rewarded. But when children did not follow, rumor matched the wind and bitterness sharpened among the Henleys. Samuel's disappointment curdled into contempt, and his brothers learned to mimic him. Where once there might have been care, there was now a piling of small cruelties. The night Samuel died folded in Martha's memory like an old apron, creased by habit and then gone through by a single hand. When Samuel's fist fell, it struck more than flesh, it struck the inventory of her life. A tally of small cruelties stacked like kindling. She moved without drama, with the hard economy of someone who had learned caution. The knife felt less like a weapon and more like a reclaimed purpose. The brothers kept to the porch, their laughter slow and mean with drink. They were present and absent at once, the sort of witnesses who never intervene. The blade found its mark in a breath. It was quick, private, and final. Samuel crumpled as if his complaint had been cut away by the edge of the world. Martha did not wail. A cold clarity came, honed by years of preparing meat and mending what the land left broken. She wrapped him, hauled him to the root cellar, and set about the grim work with the competence of someone who had butchered deer and salted hams. Nights stretched while she divided what would serve and what would not. Bones were bound in burlap, the rest she treated as game, portioned, seasoned, preserved. Before dawn she built the fire in the iron pot, watched the stew darken and soften, and coaxed a smell that would sit like a reassuring blanket in a kitchen used to hardship. When Jacob and William shuffled in, they found Martha steady at the stove, ladling soup and saying Samuel had ridden toward Wixenberg after a sleepless night. They ate. They praised. William puzzled at the flavor but swallowed his curiosity. Hungover men prefer not to pry when food is hot and strong coffee waits. As their spoons circled the bowls, Martha watched the two men chew in ignorant complicity. Each mouthful was a reclaimed piece of herself, a terrible arithmetic of justice and survival. After breakfast they set about their day as if nothing had occurred. The ranch work continued. The horses were tended, the ledger balanced, the outward rhythm of life persisted. That deception took root quickly, settling into the house like a slow, honest bruise. Days turned to a brittle kind of normal. The ranch found its rhythm in the practical tasks that keep people alive: mending fences, patching saddles, sorting calves. Jacob and William moved through their obligations with the appetite of men who preferred labor to thought. They asked few questions because asking would require answers they did not want. Neighbors spoke in the measured tones of those who trade in rumor but avoid scandal. "Sam's on a trip," Martha would say, and her voice fit the story like a well-sewn patch. Outside the ranch, the Arizona country kept its indifferent watch. Mail came sporadically, riders crossed lonely miles. A traveling merchant named Harlan stopped at the Henley Gate 2 weeks after Samuel vanished, smelling of tar and tobacco and the dishonest cheer of itinerant traders. Harlan had a nose for what was fresh and what was gone off. He stood by the barn, inhaling as if testing the air for the kind of things that make a man cautious. "You smell that?" he asked William, nodding toward the storage shed. William waved him off. "A bit of rot in the hay," he said, weak and quick. Harlan looked at Martha, who maintained a face that was practiced and steady. The merchant was not a man to press beyond the margins of hospitality. Yet when he left, he carried with him a small unease the way a pocket carries lint. Closer in, the ranch dogs began to hesitate at the cellar door, their noses lifted, the hackles half up in that indecipherable way animals show when something is off balance. Time, which in some stories heals or reveals, in theirs began to create fissures. Supplies went missing that could be explained as theft by coyotes. Bones once thought to be dog scatterings were shuffled into burlap and hidden at night. The brothers tightened their speech and their faces when they were together. They began to close ranks, invoking a loose honor that in practice had more to do with self-preservation than truth. Outside eyes grew curious. A neighbor's son, out with a surveying party, mentioned the odd smell to a constable in town. So a process that began as hush began to fold into procedure, a note, a query, a man with a badge who mulled over the facts and decided to look. Soon a badge-bearing stranger decided to investigate quietly. The man who arrived wore a badge and the slow boredom of a job that expects small tragedies, not theatrics. He crossed the Henley yard with measured steps, the dust raising in small puffs like reluctant confessions. Martha met him at the kitchen door with the composure of someone who had rehearsed loss until it felt natural. He said he had heard a rumor, a surveyor's note, a vendor's worry, and he wished to satisfy a civic duty. Martha offered the same explanation she'd given to others. Samuel had ridden toward Wixenberg and might be gone a while. He checked the barn, the tack, the rooms. The dogs hesitated at the cellar door. When he eased the latch, the odor hit him. Old blood and meat gone wrong. Lantern low, he unwrapped quilt and burlap. Bones showed where meat had once been. He wrote his report like a man trained to record facts and then, in a margin, scrawled a phrase that would make the page tremble. "They ate him." He underlined it, and the hand shook. He rode back to town bearing that sentence and the weight of what it implied. In the sheriff's office, he spoke softly. Papers cluttered the sill, lists of disputes and debts and small violences. The sheriff listened, his face folded like a ledger. This was a place where law and property braided together. Reputations were assets. Hanging a man or a woman would mean ruin for families, claims, and commerce. The sheriff considered the cost of scandal and the fragility of order. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. So the official choices were made, a report filed and then set among other calls, a quiet strategy chosen over a public spectacle. The paper went into a box and the box into a cabinet. The bureaucracy did what it always does. It simmered truth down into a bureaucrat's silence. But action is not the same as forgetting. The constable's note existed, the memory was recorded. The act of burying it was an act of will, a social agreement to protect property and reputation at the expense of clarity. Yet secrets find roots through smallest cracks, and time keeps faithful, indifferent records of us all. The days after the constable's discovery blurred into a choreography of denial. Men in town argued in low rooms. Someone suggested an inquest, someone else reminded them of creditors and cattle prices, and the fragile markets that kept men from harboring scandal. Martha was questioned in the kitchen with a teacup in hand and a face like a practiced portrait. She told the story with exact lies. Samuel restless, Samuel gone. Her answers were unhurried because she had rehearsed them into a pattern that would not betray panic. Jacob and William sat in the back and spoke only when necessary. They offered tight nods and careful looks, but when the constable asked for help unraveling what he had found, the brothers distanced themselves with the practiced indifference of men trained to protect family property above truth. The coroner in that part of Arizona was an itinerant man, more suited to mapping wounds than courtroom drama. He measured bone and wound and noted what he could. In his report, he described skeletal trauma consistent with homicidal violence and with subsequent butchery. The paper syntax was clinical, but the subtext was not. A local preacher argued in private that the scandal would poison church pews and mislead the faithful. The merchant reminded the sheriff of loans made on Henley stock, of cattle to be driven and sold. Practicalities piled like sandbags around the possibility of justice, so the town chose a weird compromise. A formal note would be filed, a perfunctory search conducted, and then discretion would be the law. The constable's margin note would survive, but it would not be shouted from rooftops. The decision to protect the Henley name was not unanimous. A handful of women whispered behind curtains and cursed the men for their cowardice. A young farmhand spoke too loudly in a saloon and was warned by older men who valued steady work over moral certainties. Martha watched the slow process of their protections like a woman watching a gate close. The shelter offered by her silence was paid for by the choiceless complicities of others. Years fold quiet over towns that barter memory for stability. The official record dried, and the county clerk filed the pages with other routine misfortunes. Yet the marginal scrawl remained, an angry, illegible witness that one day a reader would pry loose from its paper and listen. The sheriff's file would later be found folded into an ordinary ledger, a palimpsest where the extraordinary had been written over by ordinary governance. In his private notes, the constable's scrawl about consumption sat among other entries. The phrase was direct and obscene and could not be misread. The choice to tuck that page away was pragmatic. Trials were costly, and the territory's institutions were fragile mosaics of favors and credit. A public scandal could shatter livelihoods across miles of grazing land. Jacob and William marshaled the ranch as if nothing had occurred. They tended cattle, negotiated sales, and tended to creditors. Silence for them was a form of defense. Martha continued to cook and clean, the rhythms of labor her only visible confession. She carried herself with the same care she used preparing salted meat, acting the part the world expected. Sometimes at night she would descend to the cellar and feel the stone with a hand that did not tremble. She made lists in her head like ration ledgers, measuring what she had done in terms of survival rather than sin. Rumor moved like wind through the valley. An old neighbor remembered a tune changed at the Henley house and mentioned it in passing to the preacher. A traveler at the trading post echoed a drunken boast he had overheard. These fragments never congealed into law, but they were there all the same. The brothers closed ranks and tightened speech when outsiders watched. They enforced a social geometry where certain questions were implicitly forbidden. The town, too, rearranged into practical compartments business, worship, and an unspoken agreement to avoid explosive inquiry. The moral weight shifted, commerce outweighed curiosity. When a community decides the cost of truth is too high, the mechanisms of memory bend to accommodate convenience, yet paper keeps its teeth. The constable's note remained, an ugly mark in the archive that would endure beyond the immediate choices of men. And the concealment itself became a lesson, a quiet governance by omission that shaped how the town treated its quiet violences. Martha's life continued under an imposed truce. She hungered for something like absolution but found only quiet tools of survival. The Henley house ran, debts were paid, and the visible world carried on. But the interior architecture of the family and the town had cracked in ways that would not easily mend. Still, years folded over the ranch like layers of dust. The Henleys continued to appear in ledgers and in the paperwork of commerce, their name used in deeds and trade lists. Children were born into the household and taught to speak the language of ordinary things, which cattle to brand, which barters to keep, which grievances to bury. The original wound remained unspoken, but structured the family's habits. Martha aged in the same place she had acted, becoming both fixture and rumor. In private, she was said to move through the house with a steadiness that unnerved servants. In public, she was the dutiful woman who managed kitchens and kept accounts. Stories about what had occurred became an oral geography of suggestion. A child's game would include a mimed hidden cellar. A song at a harvest festival would include a verse that older ears cut short. Memory mutated into code. Descendants learned to ask only safe questions. The Henley sons and daughters were careful in weddings and business because the stain of a scandal could still threaten social alliances. Marriage, in that terrain, was as much a corporate negotiation as a private union. Outside the family, the town adapted. People remembered the constable's awkward questions, the sheriff's anemic reply, and they performed civility with the deliberate care of people who had seen what consequences could follow messy curiosity. Archivists come later with careful hands. County papers sit bundled until a reader outside the Henley circle opens a ledger. When it is read aloud, someone must choose truth or safety, a decision that will unsettle descendants and reframe what they were taught finally. But the burial of truth had served its purpose. The Henleys retained property and social leverage. Those practical benefits are the kind of currency that teaches a community what is permissible, gradually normalizing omission as policy. Martha herself became an ambiguous figure. Some whispered she was monstrous, others that she had been made so by sustained cruelty. There is a pattern to these narratives. The victim and the villain often switch places as the story is told and retold. And so the house kept its rhythm, horses tended, fires stoked, ledgers balanced, and beneath the surface, a mechanism of silence that ensured certain histories would remain private. The world of the Henley Ranch expanded outward while its inner geography contracted into a guarded and patient hush. And before we descend even deeper into this grim tale, make sure you subscribe, because the shadows we uncover here are only the beginning. Some years later, in a county basement that smelled of mildew and ink, a reader pried open a ledger and found the sheriff's bundle. The pages were brittle but legible. The ink that had once been fresh now sat like sediment. The constable's report appeared mundane at first: dates, names, a few procedural notations. Then, in a narrow margin, a phrase stabbed through the formality: they ate him. The handwriting was cramped and angry, an admission that refused to be neat. The historian who held the page felt the air shift. Papers are usually safe things, but sometimes they become instruments of upheaval. He read the note again and realized this was not a clerical oddity, but a testimony of a buried act. He traced the sentence with a finger, as if to verify its physicality. A name, Martha Henley, appeared in another line. The ledger connected hearth to burial, kitchen to cellar, deed to omission. The discovery spread in a small surgical way. Scholars and a few city officials argued over procedure: publish, redact, or seal. But the ledger existed now in the public record of sorts. The paper could not be unseen. I tell you this now because I held that very page in my hands, because I smelled the same dust and felt the same quiet weight of time. The truth is close and coarse, and it asks something of anyone who listens. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. When news leaked quietly, descendants divided into factions. Those who wanted disclosure and those who feared the ruin that would trail a public revelation. Families negotiated what secrets to admit and which to bury further. In the official sense, nothing dramatic happened. A small notice, an article swallowed by columns of other news. But the ledger's marginalia had already done its work. It had re-roused memory and demanded response. The ledger's line became a burr in the town's mouth, grinding small politenesses into abrasive memory, until even those who prospered felt the grit of conscience under their tongues, and it lingered. The ledger's marginalia did not explode public life, but it altered the interior worlds of those it touched. Descendants gathered in rooms to argue and recall. Memory is a domesticated animal. It comes when called and bites when frightened. Some family members insisted the county had misread the handwriting. Others produced kitchen ledgers that showed unusual purchases of salt, sacks, and burlap during the weeks in question. Small receipts matter. They make a code legible. A quiet exhumation occurred at night, not in the interest of science but of closure. Bones wrapped in burlap were reinterred with prayers mumbled by relatives who wanted both repentance and forgetting. The reburial did not settle everything. It shifted tension into ritual. Older women in the community told stories that were half warning and half lecture: how shame binds families, how protective silence can calcify into permission. They spoke in tones that acknowledged both culpability and fear. A few in town argued for legal review, reopening records, re-interviewing those who were still alive. But prosecuting an event that had been obscured by decisions and decades requires resources and a willingness to disturb multiple graves, metaphorical as well as literal. What the ledger exposed was not only an act of violence but a pattern of avoidance. The county's decision to keep the matter quiet was not some accidental failing. It was a policy choice that prioritized economic continuity over moral clarity. That is institutional manipulation in its quietest form. Martha's act, whatever we call it, sits inside that pattern. At the level of raw fact, she killed Samuel and butchered his body. At the level of meaning, she was both agent and product, a woman formed by years of humiliation and a social structure that offered her few legitimate exits. This is the place where forbidden history meets the architecture of power. Men in charge decide which stories damage the ledger and which do not. Institutions, in their effort to maintain order, can become vectors for silence, shaping generations by what they refuse to name. And for listeners now, there is a subtle test. When faced with a revealed wrong, do we protect the convenient fiction, or do we press for truth, knowing that truth often demands dismantling comfortable arrangements that have kept people fed and sheltered? The ledger forces a choice: keep the neat lie, or carry the hard work of truth today. Martha's act cannot be understood solely as an isolated horror. She was formed by the constraints of frontier life, by laws and customs that left women few options and little legal recourse. Consider the neighbors who accepted the explanation because they weighed mortgages and marriages above moral clarity. Consider the preacher who feared scandal because his flock might scatter, and the merchants whose ledgers depended on quiet cooperation. Each small decision added concealment, making prosecution less likely and memory more pliant. The cumulative result was a culture that rewarded omission and treated truth as a dangerous, disallowed object. In that place, divorce was rare, property rights thin, and support networks sparse. When opportunities are unequal, violence can be a predictable consequence of structural pressure. Labeling Martha monstrous is an easy moral move. A harder task is to ask how shame, repeated humiliation, and social contempt created a context where extreme choices became imaginable. Cannibalism here operates as both literal horror and symbolic act. To consume a body is to erase its personhood. In Martha's hands, it also became a grotesque reclaiming, turning her oppression into the fuel for survival. This is not mitigation. It is an effort to map causal lines beyond simple blame. Ethics in constrained environments are tangled with economics, social capital, and the gendered rules that governed everyday life. The sheriff's choice to bury the discovery was itself an ethical decision. Officials weighed the cost of scandal against the fragile equilibrium of county commerce and chose discretion. Institutions often prefer silence because disturbance costs money, influence, and tranquility. Those quiet choices accumulate, shaping collective memory and steering the course of what is punished and what is hidden. Martha was both victim and actor, diminished by a system that reduced her value, but also choosing a monstrous assertion of agency. The distinction is uncomfortable but necessary to understand the full human shape of the event. Listen to this and reflect on structures, not only individuals. How many acts of cruelty have roots in policy failures, economic logics, and cultural contempt? How often do we prioritize stability over accountability? Ask yourself, would you act, knowing the cost of truth today? The physical traces gathered like testimony: a ledger noting sack purchases, a merchant's receipt for salt and bay leaves, a scrap of quilt with a stubborn, dark stain. These were the material clues that made an abstract rumor concrete. Hands turned pages and made connections. The butcher's cuts matched patterns on the cellar bones. Marks spoke of organized work, not accident. Sometimes evidence is banal. A trade note here, an account entry there. And it is the banality that proves the intentionality. Buying burlap or extra salt is not proof alone, but stacked together with human testimony it becomes a map. A granddaughter found attic letters, domestic notes that avoided detail when pressed, suggesting care with phrasing rather than confession. The coroner's sketches showed trauma consistent with stabbing and methodical dismemberment, recorded in the crude but exact language of practical men. Officials debated what to do with such evidence. Some argued for scholarly publication, others for discreet family meetings and quiet reburial. The debate boiled down to two kinds of governance: one that values knowledge and another that prioritizes continuity. The more the paper trail thickened, the more obvious the calculus became. Protecting property and commerce would cost truth, exposing truth might cost livelihoods, marriages, and the fragile trust that held communities together. The ledger laid bare the price of both options. Those who had the power to decide tended to prefer stability. They held meetings behind closed doors, quoted legal precedents and property implications, and then opted for the kind of discretion that looks like mercy but often functions as a shield for the powerful. The artifacts remained quiet and accusing. They were the sort of objects that sit in the world and wait for interpreters' receipts, that stained the hands of historians, bone fragments catalogued and stored, a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and old kitchen smoke. Those objects asked a question of anyone who touched them when presented with evidence that discomforts. Do you prioritize the ledger of commerce or the ledger of truth? That question is the hinge on which the whole story swings. History is made of small objects that gather to form an event's shape. When scholars, officials, and kin circle these scraps, they must choose to translate them into knowledge or tuck them away into privacy, a decision that often seals a memory's destiny. And consequence always. In the years that followed, stories about Martha took on the tones of fairy tales, simplified, moralized, and passed at kitchen doors during long winters. Some said she grew colder, hollowed by what she had done. Others argued she softened, that the act resolved something inside and allowed her to live without visible paralysis. Both versions are compatible because human lives rarely fit a single narrative. She remained in the landscape that had made her, weathered wood and dry fields, metal and rope. Neighbors learned the times she would shop in town and the benches she favored at church, mapping her humanity in everyday minutiae. Children were taught to keep a polite distance, and servants learned not to pry. When a widow or a young wife sought counsel, older women within the community cautioned in low voices, "Do not ask what is not offered." This was both survival and complicity. Martha herself kept few close friends. She folded her life into the work she could do and the chores that gave her days shape. At night she might walk the range and speak aloud to the desert, a quiet litany that some took for prayer and others for madness. There were rumors of a small benevolence, hidden gifts of grain left at a neighbor's door, a warm loaf set aside for a child's family in a storm, acts that complicated the picture of a woman most inclined to be judged. People are often both harm and kindness, and the frontier allowed both impulses to coexist in one life. Martha's generosity in private did not cancel the act but made the story more human and less easily categorized. Descendants carried these contradictions. They learned that their lineage included both a woman who fed a household literally from a terrible act and the habitual culture that enabled it. That inheritance shaped the family's sense of shame and pride, often at once. Memory became an heirloom competing with deeds and cattle brands. The Henley name continued to appear on property papers, but it was accompanied by an undercurrent, a quiet knowledge that the family's prosperity bore a provenance few preferred to name. In that way the past became a domestic appliance, always present, humming under conversation, rarely serviced, and prone to fail at the worst possible moment. The silence was both protection and a slow, corrosive poison. This story, while anchored to a single ranch and a single woman, points toward a broader logic. Institutions often enforce narratives that favor continuity over inquiry. Corruption, in its older sense, is not always grand theft or headline theft. It can be the daily habit of choosing which questions to ask and which to leave unsaid. That is the slow rot that hardens into policy. Consider how psychological control works at scale. When communities model secrecy, they teach younger members how to fold language around silence. Children imitate adults, adults imitate elders. A culture of omission is learned as skill and then passed down. The Henley case became a small training ground for that skill. The rituals of comment, look, and the careful phrase are techniques of social self-defense. They keep families safe in the immediate term and preserve the conditions for future harm. Ancient corruption is not historical wallpaper, it breathes. It shows up as a parish meeting that chooses harmony over exposure, as a merchant who calculates losses, as a sheriff who files and tucks away. These are minor compromises that aggregate. Every decision to protect an asset or reputation is also a choice to redefine what counts as violence. When the town chose stability, it implicitly decided certain harms would not be addressed. The moral ledger was rebalanced in favor of continuity. The psychological contours of that decision ripple outward. Women learn to manage anger privately. Men learn to value reputation above accountability. Institutions teach people how to respond, and responses become habits that shape future action. This is how patterns persist. When the formal mechanisms of justice are thin and the social networks thick, informal governance, the quiet deals and protective omissions often become the de facto law. We must not romanticize the past, nor reduce individuals to mere products. But we must recognize the structural contexts that make individual violence intelligible. That recognition is where accountability must begin, not in simplified moral verdicts. If we want different outcomes, we must redesign incentives, protect whistleblowers, fund transparent inquiries, and teach children to value truth over convenience, beginning today and always. Without exception, walking the landscape today, if you go, you will find little that screams of past horrors. The sagebrush has a way of smoothing edges, and a weathered porch can look picturesque from a distance. But closeness changes perspective. Up close you notice marks in the wood where nails once held shutters, stones placed irregularly where a cellar door was reinforced, and the faint flush of discoloration in a cedar chest that does not belong to benign laundry. History leaves geological traces in houses, and people a tiling of choices and omissions. To read them requires patience and a willingness to unlearn the polite stories we tell about pioneers and progress. The Henley place today can be a lesson in how narratives sanitize. A visitor sees the ranch's heritage, perhaps as a relic of bravery and frontier grit, while ignoring the internal logics that allowed cruelty and silence to nest. Public markers do not always tell the whole story. A plaque might commemorate cattle drives, but it rarely addresses the human costs of maintaining property and reputation. Monuments sanitize complexity in service of pride. It is the job of a historian, then, to make sure the plaque has an asterisk. We must ask what the marker omits and whom it protects. What do we lose when we allow monuments to function as one-sided classrooms? The answer is human nuance. We lose the ability to see how ordinary choices make extraordinary harm possible. We lose the chance to name mechanisms of complicity and to craft policies that prevent recurrence. This is precisely why old files matter. A marginal note in a ledger can rip open a tidy myth and force us to examine the scaffolding beneath it. That ripping is uncomfortable because it destabilizes identity and social peace. Yet identity must be able to change. To continue celebrating the past without the willingness to subtract what is shameful is to practice a form of collective delusion. I stand here not to indict the living, but to argue for a different relation to memory, one that acknowledges the cost of silence and prefers the mess of truth to the polished face of convenience. We might open archives, place explanatory plaques, hold community dialogues, and assist descendants through truth processes. Such measures will not erase suffering, but can distribute responsibility and produce a clearer moral architecture for future generations. Descendants of the Henleys lived with a double inheritance: material assets and a secret architecture of omission. That double heritage altered how they told family stories and presented themselves in community. Some descendants attempted to bury the scandal further by changing names, moving away, marrying into other lines. Others stayed and learned to navigate the hush, becoming practitioners of careful speech and coded meaning. One branch of the family invested in philanthropy, perhaps to offset reputational risks, while another embraced privacy so deep it resembled denial. These were strategies of survival, and they reveal how families adapt to protect future flourishing. The psychological consequences are complex. Secrecy breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds more secrecy. Children learn to ask questions cautiously, to value reputation over candor. The result is cultural sclerosis, a community less able to adapt or to correct errors. This is also how legends get made. Over time, the facts erode and superstition grows around them. The narrative of a monstrous woman who acted alone is comforting because it contains the chaos in a single figure and spares the social structure from critique. But reality rarely concentrates blame so neatly. Institutions play a role: the sheriff's decision, the clerk's filing, the merchant's pragmatic counsel. All those acts aggregated into an environment where secrecy became a policy. understanding that aggregation is essential if justice is to have any teeth. Reform must be structural because individual indictment rarely addresses the social mechanisms that produced the harm in the first place. Reparation of memory might involve public acknowledgement, formal apologies, and educational programs that integrate uncomfortable chapters into the public narrative. These acts do not undo the past, but they reduce the chance that similar omissions will calcify into policy. As a listener, you are part of the ecosystem of memory. Your attention is a scarce resource. Choosing to listen carefully, to question transmitted narratives, and to support institutional transparency is a small but meaningful accountability act. In the end, the Henley story asks us to consider what we will protect and what we will expose, how we balance comfort against clarity, and whether we are willing to carry truth even when it unsettles the foundations beneath our feet. Practical steps include creating truth commissions, opening archives to independent review, offering counseling to affected families, establishing memorials for victims, and integrating these lessons into schools to prevent institutional amnesia. If you visit the Henley place now, the pasture will seem ordinary weeds, sun-bleached posts, the slow grazes of cattle in a season that turns regardless of human plan. But walk closer and the ordinary refuses to remain polite. The root cellar door is sagging, its iron latch eaten with rust. Stones around it are sun-warmed. Scratch marks suggest a life of heavy hands and hurried repairs. I stood there once in evening light and felt the landscape press its history into my skin. The air held the quiet of many stories unvoiced. The ranch seemed like a living ruin, its dignity a fragile veneer over a practiced forgetting. At the threshold of the cellar I imagined the long night Martha kept the weight of muscle and bone in her hands, the steady work of turning flesh into food, the mechanical poetry of a woman who had learned to survive by domestic skills. I put my palm on the cold stone and felt that small and terrible tug of empathy that is not sympathy. Empathy does not excuse, it traces cause. It asks how the human mind can be won into decisions we would otherwise balk at. Nearby, a cedar chest and a rusted pot still exist, useless artifacts that bear the stain of time and human labor. Objects become evidence precisely because they persist where testimony fades. The present demands choices. Do we honor a tidy heritage that erases cost, or do we accept complexity and hold both horror and kindness at once? The landscape presses that question like a coin into the palm. Visitors often leave with a changed sense. Landmarks become teachable, silent ruins become reminders of the cost of omission. Even the wind seemed to whisper that memory is not merely archival but moral work. As guide and witness, I ask you to pay attention, observe the ordinary, and probe beneath it. The act of listening with honesty is itself a kind of reparation. It damages the comfortable narratives we depend on. This is not a romantic pilgrimage. It is a moral adjustment. The earth remembers, the paper remembers, humans remember. Your willingness to see and to respond folds into the slow ledger of history. Accepting the landscape's memory asks us to act, teach, reform, memorialize. That duty falls to the living and is the small key to a more truthful future. Today, together. The temptation in any grotesque story is to separate monsters from victims as if there existed a clean boundary. Real life seldom allows that luxury. Martha challenges our categories because she occupies both roles, the beaten wife and the woman who enacted a horror. Holding both truths discomforts us because moral clarity is emotionally simpler than moral complexity. Ask yourself where the line is drawn. Is a monstrous act less monstrous when shaped by years of indignity? Does a victim become less victimized when she acts as an agent of harm? These questions have no comforting answers. In the Henley case, there is a double culpabilities, an individual act and a social enabling. The brother's cruelty, the sheriff's silence, and a community's preference for continuity created the conditions where tragedy could happen and be obscured. This is why blame is not the end of the story. Accountability must look outward as well as inward. It must examine not only the blade, but the conditions that make the blade feel like the only instrument available. Our tendency is to seek simple villains because they are easier to punish and easier to shed from our moral selves. But if we only punish individuals, we risk leaving intact the systems that manufacture repeated harms. Psychological control also operates beneath the surface. Children absorb patterns of speech and avoidance. institutions teach what questions are acceptable. Over time, these invisible lessons create predictable behaviors that replicate the original harm. Transformation requires a harder labor to redistribute responsibility, to repair systems, and to teach practices that make silence harder and testimony safer. That is structural work, slow and often unpopular. But change is possible. Enforcement of transparency, cultural education about complicity, and legal structures that protect those who speak can shift the balance. Systems adapt when incentives change and small changes compound. Imagine a community that trains its children to value truth over reputation. Imagine courts resourced to revisit old cases, archives open and accessible, and social supports for those who break the code of silence. These are not miracles, but policies and practices that require sustained political will and moral courage from ordinary people. Starting with us. The ledger in the basement is now a contested object. It sits between two kinds of futures, one where its contents are folded into community memory, and one where it is boxed away again to preserve comfort. I have watched the arguments. Some claim publication will cause irreparable harm, others say concealment perpetuates injustice. Both positions understand risk, they differ on which risk is greater. Those who defend secrecy often do so in the language of stewardship, protecting lineage, preserving commerce, and avoiding cycles of vengeful gossip that can harm innocence. Those who call for disclosure frame their case in the language of accountability and collective moral repair. This is the essential tension of dealing with forbidden history. Do we rigorously pursue clarity at the risk of fracturing fragile relations, or do we prioritize social cohesion by allowing inconvenient truths to fade? There are no risk-free answers. Hidden agendas often lurk beneath the language of prudence. Financial interest, social standing, and fear of changed inheritance patterns are common motives behind calls for discretion. These are the more mundane vectors of corruption. Institutions rarely fail for lack of procedures. They fail when incentives align in favor of hiding rather than revealing. Change requires shifting those incentives, funding public inquiries, offering legal protections, and making transparency professionally rewarded. It is worth noting that truth-telling sometimes requires small but consequential acts. A clerk who refuses to seal a record, a descendant who offers family papers to historians, a judge who insists on public hearings. Individuals matter because institutions are ultimately people. The ledger's existence forces each of us into a position. Will we err on the side of ease or the side of trouble? Will we preserve a tidy story or risk a complicated but truer one? The ethical path often is the more disruptive. Hidden agendas do not only protect the powerful, they protect the ordinary, comfortable life that depends on easy stories. Our moral challenge is to accept that disruption can be a necessary tool for long-term health. Begin with small civic acts, digitize records, host public forums, fund local history projects, teach truth in schools. These steps widen the cost of secrecy. Today, we stand at the perimeter of a story that asks us to choose how we carry our inheritance. The Henley Ledger is not merely a curiosity, it is a moral instrument. It challenges how we define family, community, and history. It forces us to weigh material security against moral clarity and to decide whether silence is a shelter or a chain. Every community holds its ledger of omission. Recognizing that is the first step. The second is deciding how to repair what omission has damaged relationships, individual minds, and the fragile trust that binds neighbors. Repair is not a single act. It is an accumulation of apologies, public records, educational measures, and material support where harm has caused economic damage. It requires resources and a willingness to be uncomfortable. To the descendants who prefer the neatness of silence, I say this: secrecy is cheaper in the immediate term, but it compounds like compound interest into lasting moral debt. The longer you defer, the larger the interest. To those who urge disclosure, I say prepare for messy consequences. Truth does not arrive politely, it calls for courage and the capacity for ongoing repair. The public reckoning is not a finishing stroke, but an opening into responsibility. Neither stance is a moral panacea. The ethical path requires both courage and prudence. Courage to name wrongs and prudence to undertake practical measures that reduce harm while holding people accountable. This is not about theatrical accusations or punitive satisfaction. It is about building mechanisms that prevent omission from becoming policy and that recognize the interdependence of truth and social stability. The ledger will not vanish by ignoring it. It will either be absorbed into a sanitized narrative or turned into a foundation for new practices, archives opened, curriculums revised, and public conversation sustained. Choose the labor of truth, resist generational cover-ups, teach vigilance, let history emancipate rather than enslave future hearts. Today, together, we arrive at the end of this hearing not with tidy closure but with a sharpened obligation. Stories like the Henley Ledger are not entertainment, they are moral tests. You have been invited into a pattern, a woman pushed to an impossible act, a community that preferred silence, and institutions that chose discretion over disclosure. That pattern asks for an answer beyond outrage. The answer must be generative. It must produce new habits and new institutions that prevent recurrence. It must teach children the value of truth and provide adults with avenues to act when they discover it. Reparative practice includes public transparency, legal protection for truth-tellers, educational integration of uncomfortable history, and communal rituals of acknowledgement. These measures are not dramatic cures but slow repairs, like mortar that fills a gap in a damaged wall. Accepting this responsibility is not sentimental. It requires money, political will, legal reform, and cultural change. It demands that we question our instincts to protect convenience and to smooth over complexity for the sake of social comfort. Think of the ledger as a tool, not just a story. It is an instrument that forces choices. Every reader who engages with it becomes part of a network of accountability or complicit silence. Choose which side you will be on. Martha's Act, brutal and terrible, will not be redeemed by narrative alone. But the community's response, whether secrecy or scrutiny, is where moral agency gathers. We can choose practices that reduce the likelihood of similar harms in new contexts. That is the work of citizenship, to continually renegotiate the balance between stability and truth. That negotiation is never concluded. It requires vigilance, institutional design, cultural literacy, and the willingness to accept messy outcomes. To those who feel unsettled, let that unsettlement catalyze action. Read archives, support transparency reforms, fund local history initiatives, and teach children how to ask hard questions. Small acts accumulate into durable change. Finally, if this account moved you, if the texture of the Henley House has left a residue in your thinking, consider subscribing for more investigations housed between archives and conscience. Tell me where you listen from in the comments. Your location matters in the map of memory. Let your identity shift a little now. Become someone who values truth over convenience. Carry that tension into daily choices. Let memory govern your actions. Starting today, and act.